There's an issue that is big, controversial, and the church needs to make a clear stance on. That's a great candidate for something to talk about, okay? We could talk about easy things all the time. We could talk about simple topics that everybody kind of agrees on and it just makes us feel good. Or we could talk about important things and we could deal with important issues. So here's what we want to do. There's going to be plenty of time for discussion from you, from people online, if we get an online, at the second half. What we want to do first is really explain, to start, what critical race theory is, because that's confusing on its own. So what is critical race theory? How does it impact or affect the church? And then is it compatible? What would be a biblical approach to dealing with the same issues? Now, if you have questions, and you're not going to want to ask it in a microphone at any point, in a moment, they are going to put my number on the screen once they figure out the live stream. They're going to put my number on the screen, and you can text the question as well, and we'll deal with it at the end. All right, when we get to the second half, we'll talk about that. But we're going to start with really what is critical race theory? Where are we as a culture? Big picture. So here, Mike, let's start big picture. Are there any problems?
Yeah.
Racial problems. I mean,
okay.
Are those
racial problems?
He's like, yeah, there are some problems out there.
I stubbed my toe when I was coming in.
I stubbed my toe. That's
yes, there are definitely
unfortunate.
racial problems. I can, I've been through all kinds of racial situations, so I know firsthand there are problems out there. We're not denying that. We're not denying that. But once again, with this subject, critical race theory, and Quinn's going to probably explain it better than I would, but the 4 pillars of what critical race theory, the critical race theory.
Now, when you look at critical race theory, if I ever had a book on this topic that I would promote, it is this book right here. I ordered 20 of them, so they're back there. Fault Lines by Dr. Vodi Bakum. This came out 2 months ago. Highly, highly, highly recommend this book. I bought, I don't know how many copies. I bought 20 for this event. I bought a lot. I gave it to all the staff here, leadership team here. And so it is a very good book. You can get it back there. It is a lot of what we're talking about comes from research that was done from this book. So here's what we're going to do. What is critical race theory? Critical race theory is an ideology that stems out of the Frankfurt School, which is a group of thinkers who get a lot of their inspiration from Karl Marx, ultimately. And so critical race theory is hard to define, and so what we're going to do is we are going to describe it with 4 pillars. And this is the work of Bakum, narrowing it down to these 4 key pillars. And so the first pillar of critical race theory, racism is normative, everywhere, and unavoidable. Racism is normative, everywhere, and unavoidable. Here's one quote. This is from Robin DiAngelo, who's one of the 2 most popular writers or speakers on this topic. I didn't know this. Someone mentioned that DiAngelo gets paid $40,000 an hour to do training on this topic. So I'm going to be talking to the church. I was thinking half and then we'll still split it. DiAngelo says, a positive white identity is an impossible goal white identity is inherently racist. White people do not exist outside the system of white supremacy. This does not mean that we should stop identifying as white and start claiming only to be Italian or Irish. To do so is to deny the reality of racism in the here and now, and this denial would simply be colorblind racism. Rather, I strive to be less white. To be less white is to be less racially oppressive. So that's one idea. Peggy McIntosh, my schooling gave me no training in seeing myself as an oppressor. I was taught wrongly to see myself as an individual whose moral state depends on her individual moral will. I.e., and this is clear in D'Angelo's writing, this is clear in the book Critical Race Theory. If you are white, you're racist. It's unavoidable in the theory. You have to be, because you exist in a system that makes you racist, whether or not you want to, and it's not about you individually and what you do individually and the choices you individually make. The very fact you're white and in the system makes you a racist. D'Angelo says when we have an interaction, literally when Mike and I have an interaction, I mean, she wasn't talking about Mike and I, but you get the idea. The question is not, did racism happen, but how did it manifest?
That's the question for you guys, is how is he being racist toward me right now?
Well, okay. Thank you to the one person who shouted out.
According to D'Angelo.
Racism, has anybody seen the Lego movie? I love this. Vodi Bakum used it. Anyone seen the Lego movie? No, come on, be real. Be honest, okay? Everyone's like, I've never watched a fun movie before. There's a song in the Lego movie, all right? There's a song. Anybody who's seen the Lego movie knows exactly what song I'm talking about, and the song goes like this.
Awesome.
Everything is awesome. That's all. Yeah, Chad in the sound booth, he knew that. Everything is awesome. You watch the Lego movie, it gets stuck in your head. What you need to understand about critical race theory, everything is racist. By design, literally by design, the entire system, which is why it's systemic racism. The entire system is racism. So racism is normative. Second, convergence theory in CRT, critical race theory. Convergence theory essentially says this: the NPR, they say interest convergence is a theory coined by the late Derek Bell, law professor and spiritual godfather to the field of study known as critical race theory. Interest convergence stipulates that black people achieve civil right victories only when white and black interests converge. D'Angelo, she says the only time that white people will do something that is not racist is when it's to benefit themselves. The only time they will do something for the good of someone of the opposite color is when it happens to converge with their own interest.
So in other words, they're not doing it for the other ones, they're doing it for themselves all the time. It takes me back to when I was in college and we were studying different religions, and you had the one religion that says, yeah, we believe in tradition, but we also believe in the Bible. And if there's a conflict, then we believe in tradition. So the question is, do they believe in the Bible?
And when you look at CRT, racism is normative. Convergence, only time, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky. It's primarily whites, but it's also when a person of an oppressive group is interacting with a person in a minority oppressed group by their standards. This actually goes far beyond just race.
Right.
Critical theory is its own field of study, and it's applied to race to develop critical race theory. But what we have in our culture, and we'll talk about this more in a little while, is not just race, it's gender, it's sexual orientation, It is your sex, as far as women being an oppressed group. It's about if you're able-bodied or not. It's about a lot of things.
Christian, non-Christian.
Christian, non-Christian, which we'll get to. If you think that's an exaggeration, that's where it's gone. And so the third premise of critical race theory is anti-liberalism in ideology. Now, when we say liberalism, we're not talking about conservative versus liberal ideologies in politics. We're talking about the liberal arts, okay? We're talking about liberalism in terms of the academic studies. This is where it becomes, if you look for it, you see this easily now. It is not about whatever an investigation says. It's not about what the facts are saying. It's not about logic or science, or it's not about any of those things. It's about the experiences of those who are oppressed.
How did you feel about it?
How did it make you feel? And then the experience and the feelings of the oppressed groups become the standard for what is true and what is not true. And if you think that's an exaggeration, here's a few quotes. D'Angelo again, most influential individual in the movement. Storytelling, narrative reading, is the way black people forward knowledge versus the science and reasoning method of white people. Which I feel like that should be offensive.
It is.
I mean, no, for real. Like,
Yeah,
I feel like that should be a little offensive. Like, science and reason is not how black people do things. It's how white people do things. It's said as a negative thing, though, towards white people.
Right.
Right? You have another quote here. Margaret Anderson, the idea that objectivity is best reached only through rational thought is a specifically Western and masculine way of thinking. One that we will challenge throughout this book on gender and race is the topic of that book. So we have this ideology that says, look, you can't analyze this logically. So here's one way that you could analyze this logically, okay? There are a list of logical fallacies. These were developed by Aristotle long before there was even black and white racism in the world, but we'll ignore that. They were developed by Aristotle in ancient Greece. We use them today. We've used them throughout all of history. This is one of the fallacies. So there's something called the fallacy of division. The fallacy of division. The fallacy of division says this: it is logically fallacious to assume that whatever the characteristic of the whole is applicable to each individual part. That means you cannot say, wow, this building is huge, therefore every room is huge. Maybe not. Maybe there's a lot of small rooms, right? Maybe many of the rooms are big, but then there's some closets, okay? Obviously, that's just trying to give you an idea. How does it apply here? It doesn't matter of the individual in this theory. If the big picture system is racism, everybody in it is racist. And I could say, look, that's a fallacy in this way of thinking, and the response would be, it doesn't matter. That's not how we tell truth. Because we set aside reasoning, and I'm not saying the average black person does this, I'm just saying that's what they're trying to do in terms of critical race theory. They set aside reason and replace it with the experience, which leads us to the fourth part, right?
Away we go.
The fourth, we have these because we have a lot of quotes, and I don't want to memorize that quote. The fourth and final thing, knowledge is socially and culturally constructed. truth is a social construct. It is not objective. It is not based on objective standards. It is based on the voice, experience, and feelings of the oppressed. Which is why when you have certain things take place, which if you want to talk about it in discussion, we could talk about it more. But there are, shootings that have taken place. That's the most popular topic that people will bring up. It doesn't matter. Sometimes it's very wrong what happened, and sometimes it is not at all what you were told. But even if all of the investigation, including the people involved who did what was wrong, even if everything comes back saying it wasn't racism in that case, they were told one thing and they just followed through with what they were told to do, it doesn't matter. Because the question is, how did it make you feel? Because minority groups have a source of knowledge and input that we who are not in the minority group do not have. And it comes from their intuition and experience.
And you understand that this is what the theory is saying. Okay, we want to make that clear. That's what the theory says.
One more quote, and then we'll move off to the next category. Richard Delgado. Robin DiAngelo, Richard Delgado, those are the two big names. All right. There are other big names, but that's Robin DiAngelo wrote White Fragility. That was a huge book in terms of popularity. And then Richard DiAngelo wrote Critical Race Theory. All right. He said, a little bit lengthy, bear with me. There is no single true or all-encompassing description. We participate in creating what we see in the very act of describing it. Social and moral realities, the subject of this chapter, are just as indeterminate and subject to interpretation as single object or events, if not more so. My premise is that much of social reality is constructed. We decide what is and almost simultaneously what ought to be. For many minority persons, the principal instrument of their subordination is the prevailing mindset by means of which members of the dominant group justify the world as it is. That is, with white on top and brown and black on bottom. Stories, parables, chronicles, and narratives are powerful means for destroying this mindset. The bundle of presuppositions received, wisdoms, and shared understandings. The cure is storytelling, or as I sometimes call it, counter-storytelling. If you want to convince people that things are racist, and here's the big term, elevate black voices. And if you haven't heard that term, I don't know where you've been. We have to elevate black voices because truth comes when the minority explains how it made them feel. That's how we socially construct truth in critical race theory. Again, we're not saying racism doesn't happen. We're not saying there aren't racial problems, even at times with the system. We're not saying those problems don't exist. But critical race theory says everything is racist. And you can't, if you're white, you can't win. You can't change. You are racist. And as DiAngelo said, you are incapable of righteous acts on racism. Incapable, just because you're white.
And it's important to point out that if you look in the dictionary for the word racist or racism, it's not the same as the critical race theory of racism. So when you hear him using the word racism here, it's not necessarily what's in your mind right now, because critical race theory uses a totally different definition.
without actually defining it.
Yes.
And that's the struggle, is critical race theory is a collection of ideologies that move in the same direction, which Bauckham and many others try to nail down what are the key tenets of this ideology. And actually, you can argue pretty soundly it's a religion, and he does that in this book. There's like 5 chapters outlining the religious structure of CRT. But the question now becomes, that's the ideology. You may not have known all that, but typically when I talk to someone, they see pieces of it, okay? They've heard things like elevate black voices, which is fine to let black people talk about what happened to them, but the idea that we then call it quits and that's the definition of truth and there's no need to get any other perspective, that's the issue. That's where the issue comes in, is how we summarize this entire thing. So how does it influence the church, though? So let's bring it there. How does it influence the church? Now, this is part of a larger grouping of issues, okay? Race is one of 5 popular ones you could add to the list. So when you look at who are the oppressors in our culture, who are the oppressors? Tonight, what we're highlighting is CRT says, with no exceptions, whites are oppressors, okay? But it's not just whites. And this is part of a bigger theory called intersectionality theory. It's not just whites, it's men. Men are oppressors. It is heterosexual individuals. Heterosexuals are oppressors because they oppress the homosexuals. It is cisgender, which, if you don't know that term, that means those who identify as what they are born with in gender, right? So I'm a guy, he's a guy, that's cisgender. We're born a guy, our biology is a guy, we think we're a guy, cisgender. That's in opposition to the oppressed category is claimed transgender, okay? Able-bodied, disabled, those are the 5 big ones. Except we have another oppressor rising, where they're figuring out that most of these categories are really caused by another entity. And that other entity is the Christian church.
The Christian church.
Because the Christian principles built the system. The Christian principles give us traditional views on sexuality and identity and gender and complementary roles of male and female, and that all comes from a biblical perspective.
So the biggest problem is God.
The Christian God.
The Christian God.
The biblical Christian God.
Yes.
Not the Christian God when you twist it and distort it and change it. We're good with the progressive Christian God that doesn't really follow the Bible.
Right. Those that look at social justice issues as being more binding than God's word.
And God's word is unable to equip us on how to deal with these topics. We need more than God's word on this.
Yeah, and it changes. Because just like back in the 50s and 60s, what were our morals? What did you see on television? But you look 2021, what do you see on television? Everything.
Here's a quote. Marian Adams, well, there's 3 authors behind this paper. It says, the term Christian hegemony is just this hierarchy and those who are on top in this case, okay? The term Christian hegemony may startle readers who are not aware of the pervasive cultural position of normative Christianity in everyday life within U.S. schools, neighborhoods, and the workplace. Hegemony is another way of describing the cultural and societal level of oppression, of cultural empiricism as a form of oppression. And what's the cause? Ultimately, in many ways, the problem is the church. And so you need to understand where this is going. The idea is the entire structure, the system, it's all a problem. It's racist, it's homophobic, it's all a problem. And one of the primary perpetuators of hegemony, the way it is right now, is the church. And the other primary perpetuator is the family. Which is why the Black Lives Matter website, for a while, until they took it down, was against the nuclear family structure and wanted that to change.
And I think this is where we need to insert that. What the founders of Black Lives Matter, what their original group was called, and pay attention to the letters that are used: Black Liberation Movement, which comes from the Marxist era. And when you think back to the 60s, with all of the things that were going on back there, what better way to bring in this Trojan horse and use a term that everybody will agree with? If you don't agree with that term, Black Lives Matter, then you're racist, because you're saying black lives don't matter. But they can use those same 3 letters for Black Liberation Movement. And as far as I'm concerned, and as far as I read in God's Word, we are all the same. We are all the same.
And you look at kind of the foundation and where this is going, and you could disagree. Obviously, you could disagree with whatever you want. You got a will. Here's where it's going. The goal of CRT, but not even CRT, the goal of critical theory, intersectionality theory, the goal of this entire ideology is equity among people, which we think equity, that's a good thing. But there's a difference in terminology that most people don't know between equity and equality. Equality is equal opportunity for equal outcome. All right, that's good. We should have equal opportunity to reach the same outcome. We might not reach the same outcome, but we should have equal opportunity, okay?